Welcome everyone to our very first webinar on the topic of the day, and that of the foreseeable future, coronavirus and youth sports, what the future holds. I'm Tom Farrey with the Aspen Institute's Sports and Society program. I'm joined by Dave DuPont, CEO and president of TeamSnap, which helps programs and schools across the country and world organize activities through its digital solutions. I'm also Bethany Henderson, president of America Scores, a nonprofit leader in the sport-based youth development space, working with many low-income youth. And Deb Pathik, CEO and founder of Sports Facilities Advisory and Sports Facilities Management, which has helped 2,000 communities build or finance more than $10 billion in projects. Deb is also a member of Project Play 2020, an industry-focused group whose support has helped make this content possible. And gratefully, you, our Project Play family. 3,000 leaders registered for this webinar and are joining us on Zoom or in our overflow room on YouTube. In a minute, I'll share how those of you in the Zoom room can participate. The mission of our signature initiative, Project Play, is to help leaders build healthy communities through sports. We want every child to have an opportunity to play sports, no matter their zip code or ability. Today, to prevent the spread of the coronavirus, the healthy move is to put organized sports on hold. Communities are no longer gathering at fields and gyms for grades. School sports are off, as is for games, School sports are off, as is school itself. Children are cooped up at home, if they have a home. Last year, 38% of kids played a team sport on a regular basis. Today, that's close to zero. We know that last year, about 17% of kids were completely sedentary, didn't play even one day during the year, anything. Today, that number is surely a lot higher. The social, emotional, and cognitive benefits that flow to those whose bodies are in motion, much harder to come by today, with shelter orders and other restrictions in place. Parents and kids are stressed. Worse, some have lost loved ones. The coronavirus has taken thousands of lives already. Project Play, our initiative to help build communities through sports, lost a friend this last week, Marlo Stoudemire from Detroit. At the Project Play Summit last year, I challenged Detroit, asking, can this city truly be Hockey Town if no more than a couple hundred kids are registered to play the game? Well, last month, Marlo helped the NHL and the Red Wings introduce a program that will get 30,000 of them into the game in some form or another, via floor hockey in schools or otherwise. Marlo was 43. He and his wife, Valencia, have 2 young children. This is why all of us in youth and school sports must commit to flattening the curve. Yes, we need more help in understanding how to get exercise while abiding the guidelines. Can I hike? Can I run? Are there ways to bike, to play golf, surf safely? But if we don't do our part to limit the spread, up to 2.4 million people could die, according to public health experts advising the White House. Even if we do all the right things over the next month, the impact will be devastating. These are models built by the New York Times, estimates based on a number of assumptions. If these restrictions stay in place for 30 days and we abide by them, 75 million people could contract the virus. Infections would peak around July 1st, the summer sports season. More than 717,000 people would die. If we push the restrictions out to 45 days, you can see that 39 million people potentially could contract the virus, and more than 287,000 people could die. If we push it out to 60 days, you can see how it really begins to flatten in a significant way. 14 million people could contract the virus. More than 82,000 people would die. If we commit to limiting the spread, we can control this thing, not overwhelm our hospitals, and get the economy back on track as soon as we possibly can. Still, former Surgeon General Vivek Murthy said it would take a few months to get through this. The charts bear that out. So where does that leave youth and school sports, which ordinarily serve millions of children daily, a $19 billion industry in the US alone, $25 billion worldwide? What does the future hold? And are there any opportunities in this crisis? Our Project Play team is mobilizing to help the array of stakeholders, leaders, parents, coaches, educators navigate the terrain. John Solomon, our editorial director, is reporting out key trends and developments that can be found on our website, projectplay.us. To get a weekly update on the news, please sign up for our newsletter. We're also hosting a series of webinars to help you explore the themes deeper and empower you to emerge from this crisis with the tools to improve the delivery of sport for youth. Because if we're honest with ourselves, our sports system going into this crisis was not meeting the needs of many families and kids. And coming out of it, a whole new set of needs will emerge, as could the desire for models that are more inclusive, more affordable, with more room for free play and family activities. So a couple housekeeping items before we get started. We want you to participate in this conversation, and you can do so in 3 ways. 1, event polls. You'll see 3 of them pop up on your screen during this hour-long conversation. Also, the chat function. Click the icon at the bottom of your screen to share your thoughts. John Solomon will be hosting that part of the conversation and post related links. And also Q&A. Click the icon to send questions to our speakers that we can address in the final 15 minutes of the hour. John will post a summary of the conversation after the webinar. We hope you share that and a recording of the webinar on social with the hashtag Project Play and tag us at Aspen Inst Sports. Before we get started, let's acknowledge the obvious, that none of us have the answers really on how exactly and what the future holds in the coming months. Factors well beyond our control change the possibilities weekly, if not daily. Having said that, with those caveats, we at Project Play do anticipate 3 basic developments to unfold, based on our research. And in a moment, I want to get the thoughts of our panelists. I'll react to it. Number 1, anticipated outcome. That organized youth and school sports won't return until May at the very earliest, more likely summer in some form or another, and quite possibly in the fall. Why? Even if we start to flatten this curve by the end of April, there will still be a lot of contagious people in our society, making gatherings of 10 or more inadvisable. Even if the government lifts that restriction, enough parents and leaders will still understand the need for social distancing. And that in turn will limit the ability to form teams, tournaments, and other events. So I'd like to bring my panelists into this, and you as well. You'll see a poll pop up in a moment here asking, when do you expect youth sports to resume normal programming? April, May, June, July, August, September, October, or later. So to our panelists, let me ask you, Dave, when do you, I know you've been doing a little bit of research with your network on this. When do you expect things to return to normal?
First of all, Tom, thanks for having me on the panel. And secondly, I emphatically agree that we won't see a return to youth sports immediately. Our best guess is that it will start to take place at the beginning of July, build slow momentum over the summer, and we believe that 75% of sports will be back in action this coming fall.
What about you, Dev?
Well, we think of it, thank you, Tom, and thanks for the work you've done to get us all here. It has a dramatic impact on a lot of lives, and we're grateful for that. I think we're thinking of it as 2 things. One, there's the curve of the disease, and then there's the curve of the economy, and the economy is going to follow the disease. So as we get back and we start slowly seeing people, gather, I think first at school and at work, I think that is when the consumer confidence will be there for people to really decide to play. So we keep thinking it's back to work is back to sport, and back to school is back to sport. So those 2 drivers, we think, as we see announcements about it's time to go back to work and you can gather in your workplace and parents feel safe, we think that's the point at which they'll also feel comfortable with their kids going back to sport. And the same thing, if that doesn't happen in this summer, and I think it's likely that this is longer than we expect just because of all the peaks nationally, if that doesn't happen, then I think when we get back to school is the point at which folks will have the confidence to say, I can go safely to a space. But that's just for kids. I think seniors, a program like Silver Sneakers, which funds a lot of YMCA and other youth-focused programming, even though it's not for kids, that may not rebound in the same kind of cycle. I think we're going to have a different level of comfort with kids than we are with older citizens.
Gotcha. And Bethany?
So I agree with both Dave and Deb. I think we're looking at a longer time frame, and I certainly think that back to school means some form of back to sport. I think there may be a little bit of a difference between team sports and individual sports, and the difference between back to sport intramural and back to sport league. Because even when we go back to school, there's still a contained ecosystem. Once you start having cross league games or club league games, you're again mixing people from all different types of communities, which seems to be the problem that's driving the pandemic crisis now. I think one of the questions that remains unanswered is whether there will be a second surge, as some epidemiologists have predicted in the fall, and what impact that will have on sports or schools for that matter.
Mm-hmm. So how will we know when it's actually okay to return to organized sports? And, I don't know, Dave, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, we will be following ourselves and our sports organization customers. We'll be following the directives of their local, state, and federal government.
Oh, I think we lost.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. As he said, following local, state, and federal government guidelines. Schools will certainly do that as well. So I think they're a good indicator. I think workplace, return to normal workplace will be a good indicator. And I think this will still lead to significant changes. And for organizations that are in the youth sports space, it's a time, an important time, to contain costs and to prepare to be on the other side of this.
Yeah.
I don't think any of us doubts that youth sports will continue to be, we're going to look back in 10 years and remember this as we hope 6 months, right? 5-6 months, or whatever the timeline might be, the economic timeline. I don't think any of us thinks this is going away. The youth sports will be fundamentally transformed to the point where it goes away. It follows the economy. And as the economy returns and comes back, so too will youth sports. So the economic timeline, the economic curve is ultimately most important for kids.
Mm-hmm. What impact will that have on programs and facilities? I mean, a lot of programs, a lot of nonprofits out there, even a lot of for-profit companies and operators in this space don't have a whole lot in terms of cash reserves. If this thing, if we have to wait really into the fall to ramp things back up again, what's the impact on those programs' viability?
Yeah, I can address that since our customers are sports organizations, clubs, leagues, and associations in North America and around the world. And I can tell you that the impact is devastating. They depend to a significant extent for their functioning on participation fees. And when activity drops to almost zero, which is what we're seeing, then they're not seeing money coming in, they're canceling seasons. And at this point, many organizations, and I'm sure this is true of organizations represented by many on this call, are just trying to survive.
Yeah. What do you see, Bethany?
From the side of the field that I work on, the free sports-based youth development programs, one of the big concerns we have is about the philanthropic ecosystem and how it's being affected by the economy as well. What we have been doing, and I've seen this both across America Scores and many of our peers, is shifting to distance learning along with the schools. And so piggybacking on the infrastructure that is there to continue some form of programming and connection with the kids and the kids with their coaches during this time frame, because for so many organizations in my space, the sports is the tool to engage those kids, to keep them on track, to maintain that sense of belonging that they so desperately need, particularly at times of intense trauma. Our goal is to be able to be there in person the day school reopens, the day we can. The question of whether the philanthropic ecosystem will keep up, I think, is a really big one, because we're going to have not just the kids we were serving 3 weeks ago before things started getting shut down, but I expect we'll have hundreds, thousands across the country, hundreds of thousands more children who are going to need programming like we provide, because they'll have been priced out of pay-to-play fee-based systems by the economy.
Right. So what impact will the federal stimulus bill? John Solomon wrote about this the other day, a piece on our website. What do you think it'll have on keeping these programs viable, at least in the short term?
I can speak to this. We have a large number of venues that we operate, and in the short term, the federal stimulus allows us to maintain a core staff that would otherwise have to be laid off and may not be available when we reopen. And given that this is really a timeline challenge, and as much as it may be 3 months or 6 months or 8 months or 9 months in our worst case scenarios, On the other side, we have facilities and venues and communities who will still have to use these assets that they've put money into. And so the priority right now is to contain costs. It is to tap into all of the federal stimulus that's possible to maintain facilities, people, and programs, and then to innovate new programs that may need to, that will evolve out of this crisis. We have new types of both technology and delivery systems that I think in the fall will be important as people come back to sport when they get back into school.
Mm-hmm. And Bethany, what about on the nonprofit sector? Is there anything in the stimulus bill that buys some time?
So certainly for the nonprofit sector, the stimulus bill's paycheck protection plan or program is open to us as well. And I think that's certainly an opportunity. We're looking into it to help pay our coaches and continue maintaining the coach-child relationship through that period of time, can make sure the coaches are ready to go back the day kids are ready to go back. But that is time limited. And what is missing from the stimulus packages so far is the ongoing challenges that nonprofits dependent on a philanthropic ecosystem face, because the philanthropy lags, the changes to the philanthropy are going to lag. And with the economy, there's so much government money going to the immediate stimulus, which is important and needs to happen. The concern that we have in our sector is looking ahead 3, 6, 9 months from now, when hopefully some of the world has normalized, the funding for what we do is going to be taking a nosedive, and how are we going to support all the kids that come back?
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Okay. So let's move to the second anticipated outcome based on, the current set of information that we're working from. And that would be when the virus restrictions fully lift, we will see greater demand for organized youth in school sports programming, but potentially, maybe ironically, less supply and less participation. Why? Because with kids cooped up at home during the void, there is a heightened appreciation among parents for keeping kids active, but the economy will limit what parents and schools can afford. We know what happened in the last recession. The regular participation in team sports for kids ages 6 to 12 fell from 45% in 2008 to 38% in 2014. And we've stabilized it since then, but it really hasn't gone up. So let me ask our panelists, Bethany, what do you expect? You agree with that assumption, or that anticipated outcome?
I do. I think the demand, particularly from kids, let's set parents aside for a minute. Kids want to go out and play. I mean, how many of us on this call have children? You have to say, no, sorry, you cannot go play with your friends, right? They're going to be ready and eager and active to go out, get back with their teammates, get back with their sport in some form or fashion. The question is how? How are they going to do that? So even if the curve starts to lift and we can have gatherings of 5 people or 10 people or 20 people, you still can't run a league. And so there may be a shift in what sports kids are doing. I mentioned individual versus team sports before, right? In individual sports, you can actually distance kids out further. If that continues to be one of the things we need to do, well, you can't do that on a soccer field. You can't do that on a basketball court the way that you can with a running group or even playing tennis, right? Where there's just some distance. So we may see a shift in the kind of sports that are available. I wonder also if we're going to see a shift in where sports are offered, if it's going to be viable for all of the existing outside of school clubs that have grown up over the last few decades to continue to operate, or whether we're going to see more need and demand within the schools.
Gotcha.
I think you're right, Bethany. I think it's going to lead to a lot of innovation. One of the things that's given me hope when this has started to gel, I think for all of us, as we recognize week after week that this is potentially longer than we expect. We formed a COVID response team internally, and we quickly divided it into 2 teams. One was focused on security. How do we refinance mortgages, cost contain, do everything that's necessary so that the organizations that we represent or our own can survive. But the other was totally focused on discovery thinking, on what are the possibilities? How do we innovate? Where are the opportunities going to come from? What are the partnership opportunities? And that collective of folks who are really committed to great outcomes for community and kids, getting to work to think about how we can benefit kids, has already resulted in, and many organizations are doing this, technology that's, we just did a learn to dribble class online across the country that had thousands of attendees. And it's really leading to innovation that I absolutely trust on the other side of this, will result, Tom, as you hope for, and I think all of us do, that changes in the delivery models and opportunities for access. And I think the programs as well, Bethany, as you've said, I think programming will need to cater to recovery from this. This is going to be a traumatic, we're preparing for a very traumatic experience. To lose 100,000 people or more will traumatize our country. And the opportunities that facilities, that all of us, the parks and recreation facilities will provide to allow people to gather safely, to use best practices in sanitation, to model that you can come together. They really will be important locations in getting community back together. I believe that, and I think we need to be advocating for their role in the recovery from this.
And if I could jump
I agree with both Dev and Bethany that there is an opportunity for us to see innovation. On the other hand, the short-term impact, and by short-term, I mean over the course of this year and possibly likely even into next year, is going to be dramatic, because organizations, some of whom are represented in this call, are not going to survive. There are not going to be as many around. Schools, we've seen a decrease over time in school funding of sports activities. And that's not going to suddenly turn around in the fall. And individuals who are working for sports organizations, Deb referred to this a little bit earlier, are going to have to go and find other jobs. Some of them have already been laid off. So we aren't going to be able to flip the switch no matter what. And I think this will force the kind of innovation Dev was talking about, and I think we'll get into a little bit later. But in the short run, there will be a dramatic difference between the demand for sports, because we're hearing from all our customers and anecdotally parents who have kids that kids want to go out and play now, as Bethany referred to earlier. And a couple of months from now, it's even going to be more of a demand, but there just won't be the supply of organized sports, school sports activities.
Yeah, we're already starting to see it. Look, I mean, we've seen layoffs in Park and Recs in Appleton, Wisconsin, which was a Project Play champion for all the innovation they put into their program there, raised participation levels, and we lost one of our great champions in Appleton. LA rec centers, a third of them, the mayor is converting into homeless shelters. How long are they going to stay as homeless shelters after the emergency period? I talked to a large nonprofit yesterday in Detroit that serves 15, tens of thousands of kids, and there's just not a whole lot of cash on hand. So how are we going to help those folks get over the hump here? So let me ask you that, Bethany. I mean, what's your sense of who are the kids that are going to be hurt most during this dislocation?
So I particularly worry about the kids who are currently out and have been for many years outside of the youth sports infrastructure. The kids in the inner cities, the kids in the lower income neighborhoods who don't have access already to youth sports outside of programs like America Scores. There's many great programs serving those kids, but even the programs that have been serving those kids for years don't begin to meet that demand. When that population grows because of the economy, kids who can no longer afford, their parents can no longer afford for them to do high-level clubs teams because of price, I'm very concerned about how we meet the needs of all of those kids. And I think one of the things that has come up over and over, and you guys, Dave and Dev, have talked about belonging and that connection, right, that innovation. For so many of the kids that fall at that end of the spectrum, their sports team is their lifeline, right? It's not a nice thing to do. It's not an extra thing that they do. It is their safe space. It is the place where they belong. And I worry a lot about that sense of belonging for those kids, which is often unseen, and what it means when they lose that during this time. And if they lose that because their providers, their sports leagues aren't there afterwards. In fact, along with Soccer Without Borders, America Scores published a call to address youth isolation during this crisis, specifically focusing on the impact of these children, on these children of this time when they are now essentially exiled in their trauma. And when they come back, what they're going to need from their sports teams and what so many other kids are going to need from their coaches and from their teammates is not just that sense of normalcy in the day-to-day, but that processing of this horrible experience that we're all collectively going through. And how are we as teams and leagues and coaches preparing to do that, which for many coaches is beyond the scope of what they think about, right? They're coaching soccer, they're coaching basketball. We need every youth coach now to really be focusing on that social, emotional health and resilience of those children.
Right, we have to basically listen to kids and really learn where they are to a much greater degree than we did in the past, where we thought it was enough to, you know, roll out a ball and ask them to win the game. So Deb, what do we do about this? I mean, how do we look? We're already starting to see these cuts, these local rec budgets cut. Anything that the organizations on this Zoom call can do to limit the damage?
Yeah, I mean, look, we've been very effective at communicating the value of sport in communities. That's ultimately what we have to do. But nationally, our public officials, our local community officials, even our parks and recreation officials struggle to communicate the value, Bethany, of the things that you've just mentioned. Kids who fall through the cracks end up becoming an expense structure that even for people who don't care about the kids who fall through the cracks, and sadly, there are lots of people who really just don't care about the kids who fall through the cracks. The economics of kids who fall through the cracks is, I believe, the most important message we have to solidify now, because we are about to go through a decreased tax collections, which will lead to decreased municipal budgets. And we've seen historically, as you've said, Dave and Tom and Bethany, as we all know, we've seen that parks and recs and school and recreation programs are, quickly on the chopping blocks. But we really have to get out in front of that message right now. We have to be communicating very specifically the value of sport and recreation. As you know, we've produced calculators with Florida Recreation Parks Association and with California, assessing the value of their parks, because without that data in today's climate and in our society, it's very difficult to convince public officials to just do good for kids that aren't funding their campaigns. It's just very difficult. So I think it's incumbent upon all of us to get really clear on not just and I think the stories are really important, but I think behind those stories, what does this mean? What happens to that kid who doesn't get to play sport? So I believe that's what we can do. And I believe, frankly, we need to focus our efforts on lobbying local government officials to not cut sports budgets, recreation budgets. I think that is an effort in letter campaign and at the grassroots level that each of us in our own communities can be very active in. And that I think Project Play can really help us lead an effort with on a larger scale.
Yeah, Dave, you have a marketing background. Any thoughts on how to do this the right way?
Yeah, I want to build on Deb's comments, because I believe the impact of sports is not just economic. In other words, it's not just ensuring that more members of society are put in circumstances where they can become productive and we all benefit. One of the things that we're noticing is that this crisis is accelerating a variety of existing trends, many of which favor us. The increased digitalization, the fact that we're using this modern technology tool to communicate even today is an example of this. We'll see a variety of increased use of technology. One of the negative effects of that, however, and this has already been noted, but it's really brought to light in this crisis, is that technology has the ability not necessarily to bring us together, but to separate us. I expect, for instance, that we'll see more people working from home. Companies and organizations are understanding that they don't need to have everybody in an office, in a building to work. So I won't go through all the list of things that are happening, but a countervailing trend or the opportunity exists for a countervailing trend, which is sports have become increasingly the center of the community for everybody's benefits. It's one of the few ways increasingly in which individuals can mix with folks from other demographic, socioeconomic parts of the population. So they're more important for us, not just for economic reasons, but for community development reasons. So I believe we need to, and as you point out, my background is marketing. Programs, lobbying, all those things will make sense or will have effect when there is a general understanding of the benefit in the first place. people, we humans act to a significant extent out of self-interest, and we need to educate as a society. We need to educate people that sports are not a luxury. They're not just a means even of ensuring that some folks don't fall between the cracks. They're important for our society as a whole. They make us all healthier, and both physically, emotionally, and economically. And I think we have a tremendous opportunity, and I salute you, Tom, for starting this organization, Project Play, years ago. We all have an opportunity to increase understanding of those benefits.
Bethany, what would you do? Any thoughts on how to keep this divide from growing and ensuring that there is funding and opportunities in the space?
One of the challenges, as another panelist has mentioned already, is the dissolution of in-school sports leagues, right? And those have continued to decline. And that is a place where all kids have to go. They have to go to school. And certainly when they're young. And there's very few school districts around the country that offer in-school sports now in any consistent way, league-based way, for in elementary schools and even in some places in middle schools, right? It becomes a high school thing to the extent it exists. So I would say if we can bring sports back to our schools, if we can bring athletics in general back to our schools, right? I mean, there's a problem with PE, there's a problem with recess. How do we engage our community so that everybody understands the importance of kids moving, as Dave said, right? It's not just about the Kids America Score serves. Every child, our community from a physical health standpoint needs that movement. How do we bring it back to the places kids are rather than asking kids to go elsewhere? Because when kids have to go elsewhere, that creates the divide that we're seeing and that's being exacerbated now between the kids who can afford to go elsewhere, whose parents can move them elsewhere or transport them elsewhere, even if they can afford it, who live in a community where there are opportunities, right? A lot of the kids in rural America don't even live close to leagues. They're driving hours at a time to be able to play whatever their sport is on a regular basis, just for practices. How do we bring that back to where kids are?
Mm-hmm. It's ironic because, youth sports in this country actually, my book 12 years ago, it was a revelation to me. They were originally a school-based concept, even at the elementary and the middle school level. And only in the 1920s or so did they get out of it. And that led to the creation of Pop Warner and later on Little League and other community-based entities. So it's an interesting idea. Also coming out of World War II, Eisenhower, there was a real push with physical education and intramurals in schools. It was driven in part by the Cold War fears that we weren't going to have a military that's going to be able to fight the Russians. But you're right, schools they were originally and at certain points in our history have been key mechanisms to build physical activity, engage the broadest number of kids. Mm-hmm. Terrific. All right, so let's move to the third anticipated outcome, which would be the misalignment between the demand for and the supply of quality, affordable sport activity, that it could lead to the development of these new models. And we've talked a little bit about the innovation to date as well, that can better meet the needs of kids and families. Why? Because the existing model is dysfunctional at best, broken at worst. The downturn in the economy will reveal as much, making club team sports less accessible to more families. At the same time, parents and kids have learned a few things during the void: the rediscovery of free play, family activities, outdoor sports, individual sports. They will have new habits. Will they just want to go back to the old way with no adjustments? So you're going to see another poll pop up here asking you, what do you think the appetite will be for better sport models for you? So please weigh in on that. We want to get as much volume around those numbers as possible. So to our panelists, let me start with you, Dave. What's your assessment? How talk to me a little bit more about how optimistic you are about the development of new models, and even beyond that, what will it take to put those in place?
Right. So first of all, people who know me know I'm an optimist, and I believe that the crisis will accelerate the development of new models. You mentioned when we talked the other day that one should never waste a good crisis, and I think we have that opportunity here. So I'll mention that. There simply won't be the opportunity for organized sports, or there won't be enough organized sports and school sports around to support the demand. So it will force innovation. And I think that's a very positive thing. I think we should be looking for ways to encourage, for instance, pickup play, which I think has significantly vanished from the American scene. I have very fond memories for years of just informally meeting at 5 o'clock during the fall at the local field and playing football with whoever showed up. And I think we've lost that, and I think we have an opportunity to retain it or to bring it back. And that's not expensive. And it's not exclusive of all the other sports activities that are going on. So I think we have, again, the opportunity to promote free play, pickup play, and lower cost or free kinds of play, including school play, as Bethany mentioned, in the crisis, because otherwise we won't be able to satisfy the demand and we'll lose an opportunity.
Right, right. It's an interesting observation. Really, for most of the history of youth sports in this country, it hasn't cost much at all to play. This is really a phenomenon over the past 20 years that we're getting parents to write $2,000 and $3,000 checks, or even $800 a year to play a particular sport. So, it makes me wonder if we're going to see more enthusiasm or can create a scenario for more in-town rec leagues as well, and maybe holding off on the travel team environment instead of sorting the wheat from the strong when they're 6 and 7 and 8 years old. Can we promote more low-cost local activity that's more inclusive, more affordable for more families, at least through grade school? I don't know, Dev, maybe you have some thought on that, because you serve municipalities, but you're also very familiar with the travel team environment.
Yeah, we serve a lot of our projects in the SFM network are municipalities seeking to host tournaments and events. And so, I think the private sector tournament and events marketplace will go through some significant consolidation. It will downsize and right size, because a lot of the event owners, if they own an event, they rely on the revenue that they're going to miss this season. The Cooperstown Dreams Park closed for the summer. That's so for the city for Cooperstown, that's a very significant impact in terms of tourism spend. But that marketplace will come back, and it will come back because the demand will continue to be there. It's really the retraction of public dollars, and as Dave, you said, the lack of understanding of the deeper value of sport for us as a society this inability of our public officials to really grasp very clearly the value of sport, for lack of data presented to them sometimes, but prevents them from committing public dollars to sport. And the reality is, to achieve what we're talking about requires a commitment on a community by community basis to providing access to sport. And in all of the venues that we operate, we have a committed partner who's also funding access for local use and making sure that nonprofit and local youth serving organizations get access to that inventory. But that required them first to understand how valuable sport was beyond tournaments. Many of them first thought tournaments are valuable, and then discovered, sport and recreation and play for our citizens is valuable to us in all kinds of ways, as Dave said, not just economically. So I think that's the challenge for us. We can't fully blame the private sector for stepping in and figuring out how to make a dollar. We have to, frankly, thank you for at least getting those kids to play. We have to come back to who's funding sport and why. And we have to equip public officials, local government officials, not federal officials right now, local government officials with the data to help them understand why keeping sport and recreation in the budget is important for the health of their entire community, as Dave has said, I think, very eloquently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you all know my affection for or appreciation of the model that they put in place in Norway, right? They had a crisis in the 1980s. I wrote about this in the New York Times, and they the first thing they did was create a children's rights in sport document, a framework that everyone, the national governing bodies of sports, the community clubs, the government, all the key sectors aligned around. And it was essentially a statement that every child deserves the opportunity to play sports. And here's what that means. They deserve access to a quality coach. They deserve to have their voice built into the experience. It needs to be low cost. You need to be able to promote, multi-sport play. And then they really push back on the whole, they don't have a travel team environment there. Up through age 13 or so, everybody understands that it's really about developing love of game and physical literacy. And there's a time to sort the kids who are going to go on to some elite pathway or pursue, Olympic dreams or otherwise. But it's really 13 and under is a real clear understanding. Now that was driven by the government. Just bringing people together. It was not top down. It was really, and everybody gets to vote on the thing, and there's a unanimous agreement around it. So let me ask you, what do you think the role of the government is here? It could be the federal government, could be a state government. Look, I've wondered sometimes if like Minnesota or some similarly sized state to Norway could essentially say, look, this is the sport environment we want to create to raise participation in our state, and we're going to put some guardrails around this about the type of activity we're going to fund, maybe the type of activity we're going to support or even regulate. How do you, as we move forward here, what role do you see government in whatever form, federal, state, or city playing in developing a framework that can grow participation and affordable quality sport options? Dave?
Yeah. So I can start off. So I think the government can play a role. I tend to agree with Dev that we can only expect so much from the federal government, just given the size of the country and the diversity of our society as a whole. I have more faith in states in being able to implement effective programs. Not to say that the federal government can't play a role. I mean, I'm still doing exercises that were part of the physical fitness program. I think that was initiated by JFK back in the day. So I still try to do my X number of push-ups and pull-ups and things like that. So the federal government can play an impactful and not expensive role. But I have more faith in the states to be able to implement effective programs, partly because they have more influence in what happens at the scholastic level, for instance. And I do believe that they and the local governments can play a role in broadening sports for the whole community, for all the reasons we talked about a little bit before. And I think we will see that sort of thing start to happen because, again, there will be such a gap between folks who want to get engaged in sports and the organizations that are available to support them.
Right. Bethany?
So we're a rare country in this world that does not have something like a national sports minister or national sports authority. And it's interesting to me that we have grown up that way. And yet when I've been out in the international community talking about what we do at America Scores and how sports work in this country, the assumption that I always get from folks from pretty much every other country is, wait, I thought every child in America played sports. We model it on what you do. And I say, well, we don't have a national sport minister. It's a very hyper local, hyper individualized thing. And I think we have a very individualized sports environment that has grown up in this country over the last, Tom, better than me, 100 years, maybe really exacerbated in the last 20 or 30. And so I do think there is an opportunity for there to be some federal leadership on the value proposition, right? We need some consensus on the value proposition to ensure equity across all of our communities. The federal government created a national youth sports strategy last couple of years. It's there. Not sure much has been done with it yet, but there are things like that exist. There's some conversation within the Department of Health. At the local levels, America Scores works across 10 different states, and they're all different. And so that variation is, I think, both promising because it allows for innovation, but challenging when you think about equity and access to sports for kids everywhere. And so even if you think about things we've been talking about, like encouraging creative play and free play, that's great if there's a physically safe place for the kids to do that. And that doesn't just mean a court that's not chewed up. It means a place that is not overrun by drug dealers or gangs or pick whatever the issue in the community is. One of the ways that we overcome that at America Scores is we always send out coaches. So there, even for our free play experiences to some extent, there is a coach there There's an adult the kids can trust. There's someone they know that is going to be there for them. How do we replicate things like that for all kids in all communities, no matter what the resources are, no matter what the variation in resources are? And it may go below the state level, to the county level, to the city level, where you need to see the equivalent of a sports czar in those communities to ensure that all kids are getting access.
Yeah, it's nice to see. I'm looking at the poll results here. There's 37% of people have a lot of appetite. What do you think the appetite will be for better sport models for youth? 37% say a lot, 55% say some, only 9% say not much, and only 5 people have said none. So that's promising. Deb, I mean, you work with governments all the time. What do you think the role is?
Well, I mean, what Norway has first and foremost is a funding source through, I believe it's gaming. Is that correct? So,
Yeah.
you know, for a government to assign a funding source, they first have to understand that there's a value to investing. And so I go back to, we need to get really clear on what the social and financial and economic values to a community are. First, and because what I think we gloss over that often because we understand it, but when you're making data-driven decisions or you have to defend why you're allocating resources from one place to another, you have to have data that you believe in. And I believe that Bethany's right. We need at the federal level some a organizational structure that allows for that data to be verified and credentialed in some way. But I think what we're going to see is that governments are going to continue to spend money on things that they see as economic development projects, and they're going to cut things, parks and recreation budgets and programming that they don't see as directly related to economic development. And I would say that just from the phone calls I'm having in the last several weeks, all of the economic development projects that also integrate access and all the things that we do, but most people don't do. And so, right, so it's nice that we're doing it, but most people don't have that kind of equity model. So but all of the economic development projects, hey, we'll see you in 6 to 8 weeks. And if it takes a little longer, no problem. We know we're going to get to the other side of this, and it's a public-private partnership and has all this other development around it, and it's going to be great. We love it. But that's a different conversation from Parks and Rec's budget who says, well, you know, I don't really know, or why that says, we don't know where money's going to come from. So, you know, I think that in those cases, it's really incumbent upon our youth serving organizations to establish and clarify what their value proposition of the community is, and to begin conversations about public-private partnership now, to begin conversations about the role they want to play in contributing in the community, and do that at the highest levels of their local government. I think that's an action step that local organizations can take. Pick up the phone, don't wait, treat this as the significant emergency for kids that it is, and ask your local officials to participate with you in a conversation about how important sport and recreation is going to be to our low-income communities. I think that's a tangible, easy action step that if you're really serious about kids, is not that difficult.
Yeah, great advice. All right, I'd like to spend about 10 minutes here taking questions from the Zoom room, and Jennifer on our team will relay those questions.
Yeah, I don't know if you guys can see my video or not, but hopefully you can hear my voice. I'll be the talking head, I guess, in all of this. Oh, and we go. Now you can see me. So first and foremost, I just want to say to folks, the questions have been phenomenal. We've had close to 200 questions come in during this webinar. So kudos to the panelists for a great discussion, and obviously to folks tuning in. We won't be able to get to all of them, but we're going to do our best to hit themes and figure out ways to build your questions into the reporting and additional information that we'll be sharing. So there have been a lot of questions, folks asking our panelists to look into their crystal ball, just answer when you think we're going to come back, but how you think we're going to come back. So what is the difference between team sports versus individual sports, indoor sports versus outdoor sports? How about competitive sports versus this idea of free play or pickup games. If you could look into your crystal ball, what's your prediction about the difference among those things? Bethany, let's start with you.
Wow, I wish I had a crystal ball. I think it's hard to say, because it's hard to say how this pandemic is going to take us. And so if we go through multiple curves, like some epidemiologists have said, we may end up being very scared as a community about starting, stopping team sports. And it may hurt team sports more, it may hurt collective sports more, which leads me to think people will initially be most comfortable with their neighbors, right? Who's around them. So that's the beginning of free play, right? Right now, we're all saying, children, stay in our houses, stay in our driveways, whatever, your patio, whatever you got, stay in your apartment. Start opening that up to the kids in the community and then beyond. I think it will take longer for league-based play to come back, just because of the realities of how this particular disease affects us. Whether it's free league-based play, school league-based play, club league-based play, whatever it is, the reality is I think we're going to start small and grow.
And Dave, can I ask you to respond to that question too? You mentioned at the top of the call, you predict a 75% return. Can you tell us a little bit about where you got that number from and what
Right. Yeah. So where we got that number from is looking at the same data as everyone else, and also polling our, at this point, 10,000 clubs, leagues, and associations around the world. And that represents a consensus view. I noticed that the poll that you conducted earlier also validates that. So that's where that comes from. The things will start slowly. So our expectation, again, is that sports will start to pick up in the summertime. July 1st is the date we chose, but in a very small way. You asked about individual versus team versus organized play. Organized sport will pick up faster just because of the need for social distancing. The fact that that won't go away immediately, and also psychologically, it's going to take a while for people to get comfortable, even if restrictions are lifted, even if it appears the virus isn't spreading as fast. It'll take a while for them to get comfortable with the concept of congregating or allowing their kids to congregate. So I think Bethany hit it. It'll take a while for things to come back. They will, because it's an important part of society, not in the same form though that they have. And I'm hoping that there will be more participation. There'll be more grassroots kinds of activities. Doesn't mean the more elite and other kinds of organizations will go away, but they'll be augmented, in my opinion. Perhaps they themselves will be smaller, but they will be augmented by more broader based play activities.
Thanks. And Dev, can you also respond to that question? And there've been a couple of more specifically about facilities, which I know that you play a big role in, and how are you going to begin to advise facilities about new safety measures that they might want to put in place that you've already mentioned, and how they should look at opening, particularly indoor versus outdoor?
Yeah, thank you. I think two things. We because we're responsible typically for managing a municipal budget allocated towards a facility with intended outcomes for that municipality. We will trail when people are back to work and back to school. We'll begin to move back into offering programming, right? If summer camps are allowed to be open, they'll grow exponentially because parents are back to work, right? If parents aren't back to work, there's not a summer camp marketplace nearly large enough for a lot of those programs to exist. So we're going to trail in that way. As it relates to facilities, again, I think you have to bifurcate this in two ways. You have to say, okay, this is date driven, so we know we're going to be here on the other side, and we need to be prepared then, organizationally and from a staff perspective. So I think there's two committees that you ought to form. One is security. That's dealing with everything from your mortgage payments and your fixed operating expenses, and looking at ways to reduce those, reducing insurance costs because you don't have the same number of people that you're liable for. All of the details that need to go in, and then determining whether or not you qualify and what type of aid you qualify for, and making the applications. Whether you choose to use that money or not is a different decision point, but getting the applications in is important. And then on the other side, I think you've got to start thinking about how you're going to both provide extra and additional and different arrival experience and sanitation, And you've got to be able to promote that. And then you've got to be able to start thinking about programming that doesn't require the kind of close proximity that many of the programs do today. And offer brand new, if necessary, program options for kids to participate in that can support some of the social distancing guidelines that I think are going to be here for a little while.
Yeah, thanks. And Tom, I'm going to ask you too to look into the crystal ball. There's been lots of questions as related to both if and when we might see pro sports return and what role they might play in this conversation.
I mean, pro sports are going to return sooner I think, than organized youth sports, because they can control the environment much better. They'll probably return with, just the players and the staff, and everybody will have been tested for the coronavirus to make sure it's not being transmitted. I mean, this will be the demand of media companies. They need this content. I think the American public wants this content as well. I think the role of pro leagues and the NCAA as we move forward is to not just ask themselves, okay, how do we get our product up and going again, even though that is a natural impulse, but how do we play a useful role in building a sports system that takes care of the base. I mean, all of these pro leagues exist because kids fell in love with sports at some point. And if we see a major dip in participation, if people aren't falling in love with sport and aren't experiencing themselves, I mean, this will wreak havoc on spectator sports down the road. So as they go into this, and we're fortunate, we have Major League Baseball and the NHL and other pro leagues. The U.S. Olympic Committee plays a significant role here as well. I mean, how much do they focus just on the elite athletes versus using their sway with the national governing bodies to right size our system and adapt it in a manner that's going to build the Olympic movement, but also participation. So they need to be part of this conversation. Can't just think about your near-term business.
Yeah, great. And Dave, I'm going to ask you to take this question first. There's been a lot of questions around this theme of the role of technology. There's been questions about how can technology continue to keep kids active? How can it continue to keep kids connected? And then there's been some concerns about the digital divide. Are we not able to reach the most underserved populations because they don't have good and reliable access to the internet and therefore aren't connected? So can you talk to us a little bit about, as an online platform, what you guys are doing at this moment in time? And then Bethany, if you want to talk a little bit about what the America's Scores Network is doing, that'd be great.
Sure, happy to answer that question. So first of all, for those of you who aren't familiar with TeamSnap, we're a platform that allows sports organizations primarily to communicate, to coordinate, and to share experiences. Everyone involved with a sports organization. And as a result, this question is very relevant for us. And we have been proactively encouraging our organizations, from teams all the way to associations, to use our platform. And we've been seeing them do this, and there are others out there as well, but to use technology to be broad, to, first of all, stay in touch, because we're talking about communities here of different sizes, and staying in touch with the community, keeping it going, is very important. Secondly, there is an opportunity for organizations down to the team level, all the way up to the association level, to promulgate means of staying active and also building skills and drills, ways to work with other members of your team or organization on various kinds of activities, dribbling drills, or a variety of different kinds of ways that people can continue to develop their expertise in a particular sport, and also to feel a part of a community. And we're also urging organizations to use technology to let their constituents, families, know that they're there behind them, that they'll be there in the future, that the funds they paid in many cases will be used for future activities. So it's all about, to a significant extent, staying in touch and using technology as a tool to build community. That doesn't replace the need for physical contact and physical activity, but it does help. And the last thing I'll say, and this kind of relates to pro sports as well, but I think we are laying the groundwork during this period for technology being a way to share the experience of practices and games more broadly. We've already started to see, and this has been kind of interesting for me, that the stadium, the arena, the field is no longer the only way in which you can communicate or the game experience or actually feel the game experience. You're seeing outside stadiums ways in which organizations are providing the game experience. Now, look at the U.S. Tennis Open, for instance. All the screens that are out there. Same thing with Wimbledon. Same thing with, I was in Toronto not long ago, and noticed there was a big screen put outside the Maple Leaf Arena, where I think it's called Scotia Arena, where people could participate together in watching the game outside the arena. I think we'll see the acceleration of those kinds of trends that will benefit a greater community. So I think those trends will not just be at the pro level, but they'll start to percolate down to the school level, to any kind of organized play.
Gotcha. Well, I know we're running about a minute over here, so probably a good time to wrap up. There's a lot more conversation to be had about this moving forward. So listen, in closing, I would just really like to salute you, everyone on this call, everyone in the Zoom room, leaders from across the US and beyond who wake up every day using sport to improve the lives of children and communities. You are what makes sports great, and I recognize the fear and the concerns all of us do that you have in this very moment about the future. Please know that our Project Play team wakes up every day thinking about how to help and how to get this space to a better place. Please keep an eye out for our news and information reports. We hope they're useful, and more webinars in the coming weeks and months. And of course, the Project Play Summit on October 14th in DC, fingers crossed, where we hope to gather as many of you as possible in person and take next steps in reimagining youth and school sports to serve all. Finally, I'd like to thank our panelists and our team, John, Jennifer, Marty, Fumi, Rania, and Emily. A reminder to please sign up for our newsletter. That's where you can learn about upcoming webinars for leaders, parents, coaches, and others that can help you navigate this crisis, but also, just as importantly, empower you to be agents for change as we come out of this. So stay safe, be well, and see you soon. And of course, wash your hands. Thanks all.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Tom.